Hey everyone, it's Dr. Ramani, and welcome back to this YouTube channel on narcissism and narcissistic relationships and how we navigate and heal from these relationships. Let's talk about the different ways we go along so we can get along with the narcissistic person. A major source of shame in the narcissistic relationship is that we will look back at the relationship and recognize that in order to make it work, repeatedly, we often had to give in to them. Ultimately, it felt like we would agree to them and we would do the unreasonable things that they asked. And slowly it would feel like we gave up on ourselves if we even took time to notice how we ourselves were being affected. There were reasons, though, when we look back. We might have done all this to avoid a fight because we thought that if we pushed it, that we were being selfish or that we were the problem or because we're simply too tired or because it just brought up this vague sense of fear. But not everyone who gives in feels ashamed. What's the difference between these groups? The challenge is that there are two sort of mechanisms in terms of how this happens that we give in. So one, it's sort of a sympathetic nervous system response. It's that list of fight, flight, fawn, freeze, submit. Involuntary responses that kick in when we experience a sense of threat. And it may be a felt sense of threat because we hold it somatically. There may not even be anything ostensibly happening in our environment, but something comes up and it may resemble something from your past. And lots of people who've experienced narcissistic abuse, especially since childhood, may experience the fawn response, that sort of involuntary pleasing, appeasing, capitulating, relenting, modifying ourselves response that most of us who fawn have looked at over the years with a sense of shame. A sense that we were somehow complicit, we were enablers, we were emboldeners, and we made it worse with our involuntary swoon, or at the very minimum, with just agreeing and going along. It's not quite the silence of the freeze, nor the absolute capitulation of the submit, or even the mild dissociation of the flight. But it's a response that could range from seductive to playful to soothing to pleasing. It depends on the situation. But it was involuntary. You were not doing this on purpose. Sympathetic responses exist to keep us safe and are evoked when we feel like we're at risk or a threat. The fawn response in many ways is quite what we call prosocial. It's not that anger or frustrated fight response, like I said, nor is it that dissociated flight response. It allows us to maintain an attachment to the narcissistic person and fosters a sort of safety in that relationship. It allows it to sustain, but I cannot put too fine a point on it. This is involuntary. It's not manipulative. It's not intentional, okay? It is involuntary. It happens to keep you safe, and it has worked in the past. So your nervous system is going to, the reflexive responses, it's going to do it again. But that's not all of it. What about the subgroup that also gives in a good-natured way, but doesn't feel shame? What's their story? These are what I can only term narcissistic tacticians. This group, they're as close to relatively narcissist immune as they come. Every so often I meet these people and they absolutely fascinate me. The people who have the sort of mastered the narcissist, and more importantly, they're not bothered by them. They don't dismiss, they're not enablers, they're not in denial. They don't dismiss the idea that the narcissistic people are narcissistic or that even that they're causing other people pain. In other words, like I said, they're not minimizers, they're not deniers, they're not enablers. They know the narcissistic people are a problem. They themselves are just not bothered by them. And what they have figured out is how to keep the trains running on time. They sort of, these people who have this skill, I guess, they sort of good-naturedly say, sure, yep, you're right, all good. Yeah, you're right, this Chardonnay, it's great, let's get it. And or say, yep, let's just do it. You've done deals like this before. If you were to take this person aside later, they will whisper to you and say, of course they aren't right. They don't know what the hell they're talking about. That Chardonnay they picked was toilet water. And I know they're going to screw up this deal. So they kind of give in, but it's voluntary. It's not a fawn. It's tactical. In some cases, it may be done to save time, to save a headache, to avoid a scene, or often because they just can't be bothered. When I talk to these folks, and there's not a lot of them out there, they will say things like, this person is a waste of time. They're going to do it their own way anyhow. Or they might say, I stopped doing business with them a long time ago. They can make their own messes now. Or they'll say, I see them every so often. I nurse the crappy wine. It's not worth the headache to take them on. Or they'll say they're just stupid. But fighting with them puts my mom and sister on edge, and I don't want to rattle my mom and sister. In some cases, this tactical sort of immune group may call the narcissistic person out, and they're not scared of the blowback. They will be willing to call BS on the narcissistic person. And because these sorts of immune tactical people aren't scared of the narcissistic person's rage, they will not be rattled the same way if the narcissistic person screams at them. And in a weird way, they start earning some grudging respect from the narcissistic person. That doesn't mean that the narcissistic person doesn't act like an a-hole with them. They do. But in this case, it's a fair fight. So you might be wondering, who are these people and how can I become one of them? Well, this group often has some advantages. First of all, they may not have had a really bad history of narcissistic abuse in the past. They may have had some history of it. And if they did have a history of it, and even if it was pretty bad, they were able to get out of it. For example, they were able to move away and wouldn't have to have as much to do with the narcissistic person anymore. But they tend not to experience a severe soul-sapping, destabilizing, long-term version of it. Second, people with this sort of superpower may have societal power. By that I mean they may not be an ethnic minority group member. They're typically men, but not always. I've met a few white women who are like this, but in all cases, they were often very educated and also had a fair amount of money. So there's some resource there. These are folks that may not have any other vulnerabilities or organizations in society that hold them back as a whole, meaning that they may get respect and be heard in other settings in their life. Third, they may not have inflated egos, but rather healthy egos. They know who they are, but they don't need to prove it to someone else, least of all to a narcissist. Fourth, they do have empathy. They know that getting into it with the narcissistic person may make things more difficult for someone else, so they won't do it for that reason because they don't want someone else to get hurt. Fifth, they may not have other significant psychiatric or psychological patterns or things going on that would make navigating these relationships more difficult. Their anxiety is maintained at a normal level. They tend not to be depressed. They tend not to have post-traumatic sequelae or other patterns that are often associated with the hypervigilant, quicker, safety-oriented sympathetic nervous system responses or the vigilance that people may have developed in other harmful relationships. This also may be a group that has been through a hell of a lot of therapy. Some people critique this group. They'll say, well, if they have this kind of power and they could take on the narcissistic person, shouldn't they? In the spirit of protecting others? Why? The narcissistic person is not going to learn from anyone taking them on. And in fact, may rage even more at the more vulnerable people around them who the narcissistic immune person or the tactical person is trying to protect. People who are, again, more tactical like this can actually really be good, what I call middle people, right? A sort of a fixer. That's the barrier between the narcissistic person and other people. For example, is a layer between a narcissistic boss and the people who work for him, or a layer between a narcissistic parent and a grandparent and others in the family. This is a person that doesn't get affected as much by the narcissistic person's BS in the same way, and is more, again, more willing to call them out, which means that they may be able, again, as this in this middle zone, to protect the people who aren't as immune or don't have as much power. For example, in an employment setting where the narcissistic person is not leaving the job, nor are they getting fired, or in a family situation, this sort of immune middle person can be helpful. But can we cultivate any of this in ourselves? It's tricky. You can't just jump here. You maybe need to do trauma work, get to true radical acceptance, get to a place in your life where there's no real dependency on the narcissistic person or the enabling universe around them. In a way, individuation and autonomy can make this possible, as can a very good sense of humor, being agreeable, zero fragile ego. I mean, it really does require a certain kind of personality. Because there is a difference between the person who tactically gives in to the narcissistic person so as to not waste time, who sees it clearly and isn't gaslighting anybody, and the survival-oriented fawn response that many people have towards the narcissist. The person who does this tactically typically feels no shame. They may actually feel quite sad and hurt for the people being harmed, but shame, no. While most of us are probably never going to get to this full tactical narcissistic immunity, here's hoping that we can at least get into a place where we can become more tactical, if for no other reason than to save some time. Thanks again.